Welcome to the fourth episode of the NERI Video Podcast Series, looking at different issues relating to Ireland's economy, trade unions, workers' rights, fairness. I'm Ailish Ryan, I'm a Workers' Party representative and I'm also a member of SIPSU Trade Union, and I'm joined by Tom MacDonald, a senior economist with NERI, who has written a recent paper looking at wealth and property taxes in Ireland at the moment, and we'll be discussing that today over the next half an hour or 40 minutes. We saw just last week on the telly that our childcare system is not only costing parents up to €1,000 a month per child, but also putting children at serious risk. It's a completely private system, something that's almost unique in Europe. And this is really a quite extreme example of how Ireland's broken relationship between taxes and public services is damaging families, damaging children. And I think it really goes to show why it's so important to look at issues like this and think realistically about how we can create the kinds of the kind of tax system that can improve those public services. So that's the context where we're going to look at things like wealth, property, how we can create revenue from them for good public services. So Tom, I suppose one of the major things that's always kind of trotted out by Fine Gael politicians is that we have the most progressive taxation system in Europe. We hear it in the Dáil every day, we hear it on TV programmes every evening, and I would feel that often progressive activists feel a little bit at a loss to know, well, what's the problem then? If we do have this great progressive taxation system, why is it that it's so hard to fund public services? Where's the obstacle? What would you say to that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is when they talk about a progressive tax system, they're just talking about the income tax system. And while we do have a progressive income tax system, there are a wide range of tax breaks and reliefs that allow higher earners to reduce their effective tax rate. In addition to that, what you don't get from that narrative is that taxes on consumption, so VAT, excise, and so on, make up a very large proportion of taxes in Ireland, and those particular taxes hit lower income households the most. They pay a higher proportion of their income on those type of taxes. So a progressive income tax system, but not a progressive tax system overall. And alongside that, overall, Ireland has a lower level of taxation compared to other Western European countries on a per person basis. And what that means is we have less money for public services, such as on childcare. And we know Ireland is one of the most expensive countries in the world for childcare. Second worst in the world in terms of the cost of childcare relative to average earnings. Only the United States is worse. And that's a function of the type of economic model that we've chosen to pursue in terms of our taxation system. Rather than having a fully functioning tax system, we have a series of cash transfers, so people pay out of their own pockets. And one of the arguments often given in favour of low taxes is that they're good for the economy, yet the truth of the matter is that the highest tax countries in the world, places like Denmark and Sweden, have much higher employment rates than Ireland and have extremely productive workforces. So they have been able to find the magic formula of high taxes, high levels of well-being, and a very, very productive workforce.
Mm-hmm. And I think, one of the things that comes across in debates within the left often is this, I suppose, the debate around who should be paying more tax and what is a tax. Is it is the new television license being introduced a tax? Is the bin charges a tax? Are these progressive things that people on the left should be welcoming because they're funding public services? I think maybe that narrative is something that really it can tend to alienate people who are really strapped for cash and are experiencing really poor quality services, often privatised services, but often also public services that are chronically underfunded and quite poor quality. Being told that the definition of a progressive system is one where they would be paying more tax, maybe it's not an argument that people are going to swallow unless it's accompanied by some significant change in how that tax system works. So, like, what do you think are the kinds of changes to the Irish taxation system broadly that might make it clearer to working class communities, to trade unionists, to workers, why it is that taxation is an important part of a fair society? What kind of changes would you like to see?
Well, you're absolutely right that different taxes affect different people. The TV license, for example, is essentially a flat household charge, which affects everyone regardless of their income and regardless of their wealth. So from that perspective, on very narrow grounds, that would be quite a regressive tax. And there are other problems within the system. As I pointed out, taxes on consumption tend to affect low-income households. Now, and then you can have a policy tension. So, for example, taxes on excises usually exist to disincentivize certain types of behaviour. But again, they will disproportionately hit low-income households unless there are offsetting measures. And the idea of a carbon tax and how to deal with a carbon tax is something that's very much in the news at the moment, and we can talk about that later if you like. In terms of how Ireland is different and where we're low tax, really the big difference is actually in terms of social insurance. Employer PRSI is significantly lower in Ireland than it is in peer European countries. By peer I mean other high-income Western European economies. And that means that there's much less resources available in terms of government revenue overall. Another area where Ireland undertaxes is in the area of what we call capital stocks. And what we mean by that are things like wealth taxes, inheritance taxes, property taxes. So those two areas, PRSI, mostly on the employer side, and capital stocks. If you eliminate those two areas, if you bring us up to European norms, we would actually be fairly average in terms of taxation.
So just on that issue then, because that's obviously the main focus of the most recent piece of research you've done, on that issue of wealth in Ireland and what you'd call capital stocks, could you give us an example of like how much of that is there, of the different kinds of wealth that you think we could be taxing more? How much is there? How much of it is associated with high earners? How much of it is the family home that people live in? What's the breakdown? I think people are much less familiar with that than say with income, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And people pay far more in income tax and indeed in VAT than they do.
Is that the same in other countries?
It would be. By and large, income tax and VAT are the two, and corporation tax tend to be the big headings in excise.
Okay.
For taxation. Wealth stocks do not get taxed in nearly to the same extent. So when we talk about taxing capital stocks, we're really talking about taxing wealth. So the two main types of wealth tax, the first one is inheritance tax, and gift tax. In Ireland we call that capital acquisitions tax. But you can be gifted over 300,000 from your parents before you have to pay a penny on that. Now if you're a nurse on 40,000, if you work an hour of overtime, you'll pay half of your income on tax. If, however, you're simply awarded or given a house worth 300,000 by your parents, you don't have to pay a penny on it. So there's a clear inequity there. And even within inheritance tax, there's a range or a host of reliefs that allow you to reduce the amount of tax you actually pay. So, for example, there's a 90% relief on business and agricultural assets, which means you have to inherit over 3 million before you pay any inheritance tax at all.
And that's all business and agricultural? All
business and agricultural assets are reduced.
So like a large corporation being passed from within the family, is it?
To a son or daughter, you would essentially get that tax free. I
think most people would actually assume that only applies to like farmland. You know, they would think it's kind of a fair deal for an underprivileged industry, but it's actually the same system for all. That's right.
So ultimately, the biggest form of wealth inequality, if you look at where it comes from, it comes from your parents. So it's this intergenerational wealth transfer that actually leads to the massive wealth inequalities and disparities that we see at the moment. Even to this very day, the warriors that came over with William the Conqueror in 1066, if you look across the Tory benches over the last 10 or 15 years and you see the names Haig and Cameron, these are people that came over 1,000 years ago, obtained a lot of land through force of arms, and that wealth still retains throughout the generations.
Yeah.
So I mean, people can talk about equality of opportunity, but when you have such grotesque wealth transfers from generation to generation, equality of opportunity is of course a nonsense.
So is there any rationale for allowing tax-free inheritance of any, like how far would you like to push it in terms, say if we just take inheritance to begin with? What do you think, I suppose, if you take two things, what would your ideal system be in terms of fairness, and then what would you propose that's politically feasible?
Yeah, well, I mean, if I was designing an ideal system, I suppose allowing people to inherit up to maybe the average annual income for an entire year, or perhaps a multiple of that over your entire life. And what's important is the person who's receiving the money, not the person who's giving it away. So as it stands at the moment, you can give a child, or at least you have a threshold for a child over 300,000. But if you want to give that money to a friend, it's just 16,000. So there's automatically an inequity in that. So allowing people to get up to 5,000 or 10,000 from any one other person, in my view, would be fair. In terms of political feasibility, we're certainly a long way away from that. And I'm told that more energy is expended by households on avoiding capital acquisitions tax, inheritance and gift tax than on all other taxes combined. People want to give the house or the farm or the business or the bearer bonds to their children. And
it's interesting, I think, a point somebody raised with me, which I'd never thought about before. Like I would have very strongly opposed the sell-off of council housing, and you know that's not something that's always popular with working class communities, because it is seen as like, you know, the one way of getting a bit of financial security, or it has been historically. And I think now the next generation is of people born in council estates are starting to see that it didn't really give the security it was supposed to. But what somebody pointed out to me is that unless you like radically tax inheritance, it will it's not I suppose the only way to ensure that there isn't an inequality created. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. You want to give more and more people a sense that living in public housing is almost equal to living in private housing. And many people have absorbed the idea that it can be just as secure. You know, you can pass it down to your children so long as they continue to live in it. But there's still a perception that it's unequal because somebody can sell their home and distribute the profits to their children, but somebody living in council housing can't do that unless they buy it off the council. And I just thought that was a really interesting example of how inheritance, even of just a family home in, you know, a fairly middle income family, really disadvantages home property owners versus non-property owners. But I presume most of the wealth that's transferred is in higher income groups rather than people who only have a family home. Like if you think of the average is 3 kids, I suppose people have in Ireland still, so 300,000 per person means you can get up close to $1 million that can be distributed to your kids without any tax. And like that's obviously well above the average value of a family home.
Yeah, and indeed it goes even further. You can also gift each of your children 3,000 each year tax-free.
Additionally,
and both parents can do that, so that's another 6,000 per annum.
Right.
So it's actually, and there's additional reliefs as well.
Yeah.
But it is true. I mean, there is a concern about wealth inequality and concentration of wealth and the power that gives certain groups, and the lack of power that other groups face when they don't have access to that type of wealth, and the connections that come with that and the influence that comes with that. But ultimately, it is the intergenerational component, the wealth that you get from your parents and from other people, that really drives wealth inequality over time. And it's the nature of wealth to generate more inequality over time, because wealth generates income. That income can be used to buy more assets, and that continues ad infinitum. Whereas if you have no wealth or very little wealth, you're unable to do that. And the only way you can prick that bubble over time is through inheritance tax or through a wealth tax.
You really get a sense of like the kind of old-fashioned Marxist definition of class when you start to talk about it that way, like, because we get caught up in like rigmarole of like, if you're on 80 grand, how privileged are you versus somebody on 50 grand versus somebody on 120 grand. But really, that's quite a, I suppose, a right-wing narrative that we should be focusing on income, whereas like the real power in society is with those people who have enough wealth to invest to create more wealth. And I think it is really important for the left to start putting the focus on that group of people who can use their wealth to create more wealth. That's, I think, we don't probably do that enough, you know.
No, absolutely, and there's a few recommendations in the paper. So obviously, the paper focuses on tax reliefs and tax expenditures, tax breaks, whatever you want to call them, which tend to disproportionately benefit the better off. And there's arguments for sunset clauses and ways to kind of shut off these tax breaks after a number of years if they don't continuously pass a quality proofing thresholds or whatever it might be. So the paper does talk about generating extra revenue from inheritance tax, but it also talks about introducing a net wealth tax in Ireland. And again, the purpose of a net wealth tax is to offset the disproportionate power that some groups and the corrosive power that comes with that some groups have in society. And certainly a net wealth tax, which could come in at a threshold of $1 million. So you're talking about net wealth of $1 million.
What do you mean by net wealth? Why are you using that phrase?
Net wealth means essentially if you add up the value of all of your assets, so houses, jewellery, cars, stocks and bonds and all of that, and then deduct all of your debts. So for example, you might have a house, but during the austerity years in particular, a lot of those houses would have been in negative equity. So you might have had a house worth 500,000. But if your mortgage was 700,000, that meant your net wealth on that asset was minus 200. So we're talking about people who have positive net wealth of at least $1 million. And you know, some might argue for a more robust wealth tax than that, but I think that would be a good place to start. Bringing in a tax like that, and it could be a rate of, even a rate up to 1%, you would still generate hundreds of millions a year. And just to put that in context, to make public transport free in Ireland today would cost a little over 600 million. So it doesn't sound like a lot of money, 300 million, but it can go a long way towards introducing really, really progressive policies in terms of universal public services. And those are the type of policies that improve people's access and improve people's inclusion within society, not to have to worry about transport, and obviously huge environmental benefits from that as well. That's just one example of things that you could do. And in the paper you have some hesitations about the way wealth taxes have been introduced in other countries. That's right. So what are those, and how would you like to see it introduced differently in Ireland? The main hesitations there are wealth taxes in other countries have been brought in with all sorts of tax reliefs and
what kinds of things?
Tax breaks for certain types of assets, for example. And what happens in that case is the wealthy just shift to the type of assets that are not counted for the purpose of the wealth tax, and that makes it extremely easy to avoid paying the tax at all. So you would argue for none at all. All assets should be treated exactly the same, except for certain esoteric assets like your education, for example, which some people would regard as an asset, but you can't sell it. Even our pension, for example, is something that you can't sell, at least not in Ireland, and therefore it isn't a commodity that can be bought and sold, and therefore you can't really value it. But with those few exceptions, everything else should count. And there's ways to get around valuation problems and everything like that. But you count everything. But if you have a high enough threshold, and it's set at $1 million, for example, then the only people that could possibly be affected by that are people that have net wealth of $1 million or more, which makes them millionaires. I was just really surprised, to be honest, when some people on the left did campaign against the reduction. There was a proposal to reduce the amount that could be inherited
tax free, and there were certainly opponents to that from the left, which I think it's inexcusable. Like, I understand that people feel life is very difficult. They have to be able to give their kids a leg up. It's so hard to get onto the housing property market and all that kind of stuff. But inheritance is easily the most, as you said, regressive form of wealth transfer, and we just can't support it, I don't think. So I think, so those seem to be the two, kind of a wealth tax and an inheritance tax. Is there anything else there that you think merits kind of discussion?
Absolutely. Another example would be in relation to what we call capital gains tax. This is an example of how capital is taxed differently to labour income. So, labour income is taxed at 20%, and then there's a marginal rate that kicks in. But capital income is taxed differently. Not all of it.
So maybe you could just define what you mean by capital income.
Sure. There's different types of capital income. So rental income, for example, is treated in the same way as labour income so it's considered as part of income tax. But a capital gain is the profit you effectively make on an asset. So if you buy an asset for 150,000 and you sell it for 250,000, you've made a capital gain of 100,000.
Without doing any work.
Well, indeed, yeah, speculating, gambling, if you will. But you are taxed on that at a lower rate than you would be if you're if all that income was coming from labour. So there is an issue there as to whether or not capital gains, at least for individuals and households, should be treated the same as all other sources of income, and that 100,000 should be treated as income tax. And I know certainly that's a position that the OECD have adopted. And one of the ways that billionaires in the United States, for example, reduce their tax bill is by treating all of their income as capital gains, which is beneficially treated compared to income tax. So one of the arguments is, and this isn't just relevant to Ireland, but the United States and other countries, is to remove this capacity for people to reduce their tax bills by calling it capital gains.
Right. Yeah.
So that's kind of a third area. The fourth area, and probably the most contestable, is that the paper argues for a ramping up of the local property tax. And I know there's been a lot of political debate about that, and as it stands at the moment, we talked about wealth stocks and capital stocks, and one of the areas where Ireland undertaxes relative to these other high-income countries in the OECD, including places like the United States, is in relation to local property taxes. And the evidence from the literature suggests that these taxes tend to be very growth-friendly, so they tend to be good for the economy in the long run. They tend to be very, very difficult for the wealthy to avoid because you can't hide the house. And they tend to be pretty reasonably sustainable over the economic cycle, so they don't collapse like stamp duty would collapse during a recession, or capital gains for that matter. They tend to be progressive if they're properly designed, and we can get back to that. And I know there are hardship issues associated with property tax, but ultimately what the paper argues for is that certainly there should be a local property tax. Second of all, there should be the same property tax rate everywhere, and the reason for that is that two people with the same value asset should pay the same amount of tax on it, regardless of where they live. And third of all, this provides an opportunity, increasing local property tax, to increase the revenue yield, which could then be used for progressive policies such as building council houses. Again, it could be providing better local amenities in terms of public transport options, whatever it might be. So ultimately, over a 10-year period, the paper argues that the rate, which is currently 0.18, would increase or double to 0.36, which means going up by 0.01 or 0.02 every year, which sounds like a lot of money, but 0.01 is, on the average house, is $27.50 per year, which is, or 50 cents a week. So, and And local property tax brings in much, much less revenue than income tax or VAT. And people pay far, far more in areas like VAT than they do in relation to local property tax. And VAT, for example, is much more aggressive than the property tax. So even if you didn't want to increase public services, even if you just wanted to reduce the tax take on households, you could do it by reducing consumption taxes and then putting the burden more on capital, which means things like the property tax ultimately.
Sure. Like, I think there's two different sets of arguments relating to the household charge. One being kind of political arguments, which I think like we can kind of let aside, but I think it's been lost effectively trying to introduce something like that at the height of a recession when people were so strapped. I'm not sure it's ever possible to shift that into something that people view as a progressive move. And I think that's often one of the things that frustrates me about the way in which right-wing governments, they kind of they end up associating things that could potentially be progressive with like pain and austerity, and as a result popular opinion shifts completely against them in a kind of an irrecoverable way. But separately then I think there are kind of economic arguments. Like I think probably my own view on it has been influenced by the constituency that I represented, which is the inner city, where you probably see like more fluctuation in income levels from one house to another than anywhere else. And so for example, you'd have, you know, somewhere like East Wall, like the widow of a docker living in a house next door to a young couple with a combined income of 150,000, and that's very common. But also you would see like working families who had maybe inherited the family home at a time when the areas were very working class, with maybe a combined income of 40 grand. Next door to, you know, in Stoneybatter you could easily have you know, a combined income of up to 200,000. And so it's not so much hardship cases, just, I mean, you know, you can design anything for hardship cases. It's like a broad range of working households with different incomes. And I do find it hard to justify why those two households should be taxed similarly, especially because the higher income couple is much more likely to eventually dispose of their asset and move. That's generally the trend. Whereas, you know, you could have like two families living in next door to them, in like multi-generational households, because the kids can't afford to move out, and that house is never going to be disposed of. It'll never be converted into an asset. And I suppose just coming back to what you were saying earlier about, you know, things like education that are not considered assets as such because you can't sell them. I think there's a strong argument that the family home should also, we should really be trying to move to a situation where it's not considered an asset that can be sold, and as such it's not something that should be considered as part of your wealth. And obviously that would involve changing the way we treat it in other ways. So for example, I mean, at the moment people can take out loans against their family home apart from their income, apart from their mortgage, and I think that's something that maybe we need to look at. And also the fact that, you know, you were saying in Ireland there's or in other countries it proves to be it doesn't collapse the way say stamp duty does, but I would assume in Ireland, because house prices tend to fluctuate so much, actually it would be less stable. So I think, you know, it has the potential to kind of reinforce the idea that like property is something to be bought and sold, housing is something to be bought and sold, which has done a lot of damage in Irish society. And I think, you know, really like the taxing at the point of inheritance or at the point of sale makes an awful lot more sense. From a justice point of view, you know, it really only becomes an asset when it's sold. I don't think you should be telling somebody your home is an asset until they make the choice to make money out of it effectively. So I don't know, I think it's a hard one to sell.
It is, and of course what the paper proposes is that for low income households, that what you do instead is you put a lien on the property, so that you only pay the property tax on sale or transfer. So when the owners pass away, or if they do decide to monetize it and sell it, that effectively the money owed to the state in the form of the property tax would then come due. And if you attach an interest to that, which again is only paid through the sale, through taking a portion of the value of the sale, you, in terms of the recipients, they get they still get the inheritance if that's the case, but just less the property tax. They're still benefiting, and the lower income household still gets to live in its house without paying a property tax. Alongside that, I suppose one of the things that makes a property tax more difficult than, say, income tax, PAYE or VAT, is that it's such a salient tax. What I mean by that is you see it every year, you have to pay it in a chunk, often people do, not necessarily, and it's very, very noticeable. Whereas you don't notice VAT in quite the same way. You don't notice excise taxes in quite the same way. But they're actually making you much poorer than a property tax would, because the amount of receipts that come from consumption taxes vastly outweighs the amount of money that comes from a local property tax. And those taxes are unquestionably regressive and do hit low-income households the most. So if one is coming from a purely left-wing perspective and one wants to reduce the amount of taxes that people pay, how I would do that is by reducing taxes on consumption. And I would also make the point that we do have to tax some way to pay for universal basic services and public services that ultimately we want. And one of the things that long term we would like to have, and we've advocated for in other NERI working papers, is for a state body to begin a process of significant house building, effectively council houses, which wouldn't be sold. So over time, there would be much less commodification of the housing market. The property tax itself, of course, will, if anything, have a dampening effect on property prices because it makes it slightly less desirable to own a property. Another point is, to point out though, is if you do own your property and you're not paying a mortgage, you do have that asset. Whereas if you're renting and you're paying, in Dublin, could be over 2,000 a month, you get nothing at the end of the day. So if you own the property, or even if you're paying a mortgage and you get it at the end of the day, of course mortgages tend to be lower than rents at the moment, but at the end of the day, you have an asset. So if disaster strikes, you can sell that asset. And the very fact that you have that asset allows you to borrow at reduced rates compared to a renter, for example. So you are in a very different situation. You do have an asset, even if you choose not to sell it. The very fact that you have it still has value. But I agree that we do need to watch for, we don't have to call them hardship cases, but concerns where there are low-income households, and those will often be older people, in particular who may have retired. You put the charge on sale or transfer, and from a government point of view, over a 40-year period, the government will get exactly the same amount of money at the property tax. Well, all it means is in the early years it will get a little bit less, but then it'll get all that money in future years. So
I think it kind of brings you on to, like, I suppose what I think is really important is to, I think it's really important to, I suppose, consider the realpolitik of a lot of these ideas, and you know, say particularly the carbon tax is something that's very much, you know, in the news at the moment. For me, you know, a form of taxation on property, a form of taxation on carbon, those are things that make sense. However, sometimes there's this sort of demand that you know, those on the left must support taxes. And in reality, you know, like, for example, if a package was brought in which said we will be reducing VAT by X percentage, and in exchange we will be increasing the property tax by X, and overall 60% of households will be better off. Like, that's something that is very different to saying, well, you know, the property tax is one part of a good taxation system, so we must support that. I do think we have to, you know, we have to think about, for me, a really important question is, how do we get the general population on board with a progressive taxation model as a whole. And I think to do that, you have to recognise, well, look, it's a right-wing government that's implementing things at the moment. It's not for nothing that they decided to limit their definition of property to the family home and not to the gazillion other types of property owned by very wealthy individuals. It's not for nothing also that they tend to exclude a kind of a welfarist idea of low income households, when really, the vast bulk of middle income households are struggling to pay their bills, because they need, that's the group that they're interested in taxing. And so I think if we're going to start making the case for somewhat controversial taxation measures, we need to be doing it as part of a package that makes clear what the savings to middle income households will be, and I suppose start pushing our own definition of middle income as opposed to the Fine Gael definition of €75,000. And I think absolutely, there's no doubt that these are necessary to build universal public services. But you have to recognise the fact that, Irish people have absolutely no living memory or faith in the delivery of universal public services. Like, back to school costs are £1,500 if you're in school. There's €3,000 university fees, doctors' charges, no functional public transport system, one of the most expensive public transport systems in the continent, road tolls, as well as paying motor tax to pay for the roads. You ask somebody where their tax money goes and they struggle to say. And I think sometimes I wonder, is it actually possible to gain political support for progressive taxation before we've sort of front-loaded the public benefits, a universally accessible childcare system that then allows people to buy into a progressive taxation system? I think that's a big kind of tactical question for the left.
Yeah, no, I agree. And my own view as to how you would do that is you would essentially assign every part of taxation to a particular area of public spending. So people would see that your property tax or your carbon tax or even your USC is going to particular areas of public spending. I mean, property tax would naturally be linked with social housing provision, for example. Carbon tax would probably be naturally associated with subsidies for renewable energy infrastructure, offsetting the cost of retrofitting, things like that. But the political economy of a carbon tax probably means that in practice what you'd have to do is you'd have to recycle it back to households, and people would need to see that recycled back. So that they would get a cash check every year, every person living in Ireland. So the government would say, look, we're not raising a carbon tax, just to give that as an example, to take money from you or to raise money for public services. We're doing it to incentivize people to use less carbon. And look, and here's the money back at the end of the year. So sometimes you do have to make sacrifices in terms of what you think is the best policy, which might be invest in renewable energy infrastructure or public transport. In the case of a carbon tax, to make it politically acceptable, you probably have to recycle the money back to households. And if one was to do that, with everyone getting the same amount of money, then the bottom 50% of households from an income point of view would actually benefit from that structure, because they have less income, so they spend less on carbon intensive activities. So much for carbon tax. But you're absolutely right. Property tax itself, and the term we use is hypothecation. What that means is you link a particular revenue stream, like the plastic bag levy, for example, was done in the past in Ireland, and it's quite common in other countries. We don't do it in Ireland, which I think is a mistake. But if you specifically link a tax to something that people can objectively see. So you could increase employer PRSI, for example, with the money going to universal childcare provision. I mean, down the line, what we need to do there is effectively we need to have affordable, good quality childcare, where the workers are well paid and a security. The only way you can square that circle is through massive state subsidies. And the obvious way to do that is increase the social wage, increase employer PRSI, starting at the high end. So I think that is how you kind of chisel away. And of course, what people are seeing in terms of the public services that we're not happy with is that we have relatively weak public services compared to other European countries because we spend less on them. Myself and my colleague Paul Goldrick-Kelly looked at this and we found that we spend less than all other countries in Western Europe on a per person basis, in the EU at least, with the exception of the United Kingdom. And some countries were significantly ahead of where we are. So we don't have high taxes in Ireland. What we have is a high cost of living. So that's the problem. So you deal with it by dealing with the cost of living issue and through targeted tax increases in particular areas. In my view, local property tax is part of the solution. But I realise that the politics of it are very, very difficult in that case.
I think just one other maybe final-ish point. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to discuss. One other thing I think to bear in mind in all this is taxation is really important. Progressive taxation to fund public service is really important, but it's a limited framework. And I think, one of the things that NERI has really, been great at is remembering that, it's not the same as a household budget, which is what the right likes to tell us, that, we can grow our economy strategically by creating productive industries. And, there's nowhere that's more relevant than in the environmental sector at the moment. And I think that, like, you're absolutely right to point out that a wealth tax could fund half the cost of free public transport. But if you think of the scale of social transformation that's necessary to, meet the environmental demands, we're going to need much, much more investment than that. And I think sometimes it's very important that we are honest about the limits to what taxation can deliver, and that, a state-led growth model, which is really the thing that's never on the table in recent decades, is, that's where we can really start to gain control of our economy and also strategically drive down the cost of living. And that ultimately those things will have, as much, if not more, of an impact on the quality of life and quality of services.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. In terms of boosting the economy in the long run in ways that are sustainable and compatible with an absence of environmental degradation, we need to increase employment rates. That means you've got to have things like universal childcare, which is completely free. To boost productivity and to boost the strength of the economy and innovation and all of these buzzwords that people use, that means spending on public capital investment. It means spending on research and development through our universities and our ITs, and spending on education to make sure that we have lifelong learning for everyone and everyone is included within that. All of those things cost money, and all of those things are state-led. So the state has a fundamental role in Ireland's economic future and global economic future. The state will always be the single most important economic actor. And the idea that there are capitalist countries in the world is in many respects a nonsense. There are corporatist countries. And you're absolutely right. Radical economic transformation, radical progressive economic transformation needs to happen, and it's going to have to be state-led, and we're going to have to ramp up our investment in all of those areas. We do have to focus on the issue of a just transition, protecting workers in carbon-intensive industries, people who are likely to lose their jobs. We have to find a way of transitioning them to equally good new jobs. And there's a regional dimension to this. Certain parts of the country, such as the Midlands, might be disproportionately affected. What do we do for those regions? And then thinking about the technologies that might be relevant in the future, areas where Ireland might have an advantage, such as in tidal power. We should be getting in at the ground level in that area now. But we talked about public transport earlier on. It is not utopian to talk about free public transport. It is certainly not unaffordable. Our fiscal space, the amount of public this term some people hear about, that goes up by about 3.5 billion every year. That's cumulative. Free public transport for everyone
could just be,
at current demand levels, an extra 600 million. It would actually cost more because people would want to use public transport much more, and you'd want to dramatically extend the availability of public transport.
0.01% of the bank bailout costs, something like that, is it?
Wow, 600 million versus 60 billion. Yeah, it's a
drop in the ocean, like,
you know, and
they find the money without a problem, like, I think.
But there is scope. There is scope for moving the Overton window, for embracing a completely different type of economics, a different type of economic model, and the Irish economic model is not going to sustain through the 2020s anyway. So the current model of being a corporate tax haven is not going to last throughout the 2020s. Minimum effective corporate tax rates are coming.
Yeah.
Apportionment models are coming too. Ireland will not be able to continue relying on excessive gluts of corporation tax receipts year on year. So that means too that we have to be careful not to cut taxes in other areas. We have to be careful to avoid this agenda of cutting taxes for middle income earners. Focus on public services. They are the basic ingredients that will lead us to a prosperous future. Investment, education, and people.
Great. Anything else you want to add, Tom? Anything in particular that you're planning on doing next with the paper or anything like that, or will we leave it at that?
We can leave it at that for now. Just to let people know that there's a number of NERI working papers coming up, and that we have a paper on the just transition that will be coming out in winter of this year. And throughout 2020 we'll be focusing on those type of issues as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for taking the time to talk about it.
Thank you for having me.
And if anybody has any ideas for topics they'd like to see discussed in this series, they can email info@nerinstitute.net.